sorts of names as the Nation Media Group. All right, topic of conversation. We're looking at China, Kenya relations. Actually, the story in the East African front page, their headline has been in SDR race. Xi gives Addis the attention. Ruto's plan slowed by failure by his peers to sign on to the coast-to-coast rail project as China finds be more creditworthy and strategic. Well, that on pages 4 to 5 of the East African, an image here of all three, Xi, Abiy, President William Ruto. I'll start with you, Dr. Gathua. Where, in your view, do China-Kenya relations stand? And we're asking inroads made versus bridges burnt. Yeah. Considering this president has, according to the experts, has leaned heavily west.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Oli, for the question. I think Kenya-China relations, in my view, are still good. China has a lot of investments in Kenya. Kenya, I like calling Kenya the regional hegemon in East Africa. So if you want to do business with East and Central Africa, you cannot ignore Kenya. I know Tanzania is giving us a run for our money, but currently the projects and the investments that China has in Kenya are quite huge. We have roughly, give or take, around 50,000 Chinese already working in Kenya in various sectors as investors, you know, in various aspects of the economy. They've invested heavily in infrastructure. There are many contractors and all that. So I think our relations are quite good. It's in China's interest to keep Kenya close to it as one of the most creditworthy countries within the region. So I think our relations are good, all right? The president going to China, in my view, that was a testament of his confidence still in going to China and feeling like, you know, in the context of our theme today, inroads made and bridges burnt, it's in the interest of Kenya not to burn bridges with China, regardless of geopolitics and what anybody else out there wants to say. So my scorecard is that Kenya-China relations are good. Do we have competitors? Yes, we do. Like you rightly said, Ethiopia, given that their railway from Djibouti all the way to Addis has been proven to be more economically viable than our SGR. But having said that, there are many more other areas that the Chinese can invest in Kenya and a lot of more trade that we can have with them. So I think our trade is good. So far, so good. We have some minor hiccups. Of course, we've had Kenyans complaining of some few Chinese investors who've not treated Kenyans rightly. We've had those stories in the past. But like in any basket, you'll always have one or two rotten apples. But I think for overall assessment is that our relations are good.
Right.
Yeah.
Before we get into a little more detail where the SGR is concerned, in your view, was it a successful trip, do you think, for President William Ruto to Beijing? Professor Midamba, I looked, Agrim Tambo shared some information with me on my WhatsApp here. Let me just pull it up. And he says, so he was telling me what East Africa walked away with, Kenya included. Let me see. Here we go. And Kenya, China to support the financing of the Nairobi Expressway project in Kenya and the Central Urban, carry out infrastructure and livelihood and trade supply chain in Kenya, implementation of the Sagana Marwa Road project in Kenya. I won't get into but compared to Ethiopia, this is what they got. They walked away with China to elevate relations with Ethiopia to, quote, all-weather strategic partnership. China and Ethiopia signed an exchange of letters on the establishment of a technical assistance project for senior agricultural experts. China and Ethiopia signed an exchange of letters on the establishment of a technical assistance project for senior agricultural. Oh, I've already read that. We will continue to carry out Junkao technology, organized Belt and Road traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture, and on it goes. But do you think we did fairly well? We walked away having secured some good deals for ourselves, do you think?
Olive, allow me to come on this from a global perspective and then get into the meat and gritty on China. In 1971, Henry Kissinger crossed the border from India into China and what became known as ping-pong diplomacy. The U.S. re-established relationship with China. and the Chinese-American trade thrived. They lift embargo on China and everything. In 2020, January 2020, Trump raised alarm bell, which said, wait a minute, Chinese are exporting into America more than we are exporting to China for the first time. And the trade imbalance came to 383 billion to the good for Chinese. Okay? Chinese supply everything American need, and they supply it on time. And the American market and Western markets open for China. When you think about Gorbachev, Reagan situation 1986, which is the end of the Cold War. Again, Russia is open, the American West open for Russia to enter the IMF global thing, the G20, the G7, and everything. The reason was for America to separate China and Russia, never together. Okay, that is their very reason, because China is an existential threat for American interest. Russia is an existential threat for American risk. When these two people converge together, then the Western interest is threatened. Now, let me put some data that I think is very important, eye-opener for us. China, the countries that owe China money in Africa, they are top 4, okay? Angola owe China 42.6 billion, Ethiopia 13.7 billion, Zambia 9.8 billion, Kenya 9.2 billion. Now, when you think about the interest rate we're paying on those loans that we have got, and the time for payment, and then trade imbalance between corporate Chinese and Kenya, we are accumulating rate of debt to a point where we're going to be in a trap. And when we are in a trap, Chinese own Kenya. You know, because Angola and Zambia faulted on their loan. And therefore, Chinese have the right to take their airport or take whatever and control until their money is paid. So we reach a point where we have to be realistic with China. It is no longer Mao Zedong providing support for African nationalist movement. It is time for reality, and our interests must prevail, which is we are going to borrow money from China at the lowest interest possible and on a long-term loan. Because let me just talk personally. I borrow construction money in America, in Ohio. I constructed a big home at 3% interest, fixed rate for 30 years. Why can't China loan money through Africa Development Bank at maybe 1% or 2%, and then Kenya can borrow money from African Development Bank at 3 or 4% for 30 years in order to allow us to pay for that, for all this infrastructure development that we want. This is the question. And President Ruto raised that question as soon as he became president. And because of our need, you know, we need to complete the SGR all the way to Uganda. We need to do other infrastructure development. We are a developing country. And if we are choked by any of the provider of loan, we cannot move any further. And therefore, the Kenya interest lies in the balance. Balance with the West and balance with Chinese. Who's going to treat us the best? We're looking at the West, in particular America, is to reconsider our relationship. All right. Manufacturing is what is going to make us rich come to a middle class. But corporate American are still hesitant to invest in Kenya and the rest of Africa because of high, problem with due diligence, risk high, and all that kind of thing. Africa has to be open for the rest of the world, and the rest of the world must treat us well. So we need to be very careful on how we go about creating relations.
Okay. Nasongo Muliro, I know you're eagerly awaiting to jump in. Let me ask you this. The former regime, that of President Uhuru Kenyatta, was seen as looking east. This regime, on account of statements made on the campaign trail as to the debt accumulated, and the larger portion of which, as Prof has ably captured in his data there, is owed to China. So given those statements during the campaign period, he came in, he appears to be a darling of the West. With his visit to Beijing, do you see that policy changing?
I think first, Prof reminds me every time he is my very good friend, and I always say I'm arguing with an American. So he has some failure for the US. But I would say this, Olive, that the trip of President Ruto to China recently confirms several things. One is that campaign is different from the reality in matters of foreign policy. And in fact, the most encouraging thing is that the problem that has been there in Kenya mostly is that foreign policy has never been a core agenda in the campaigns of most presidential candidates, like we see the US and other countries. So you find that the masses in Kenya are not so much aware or attached, or they don't even feel the essence of foreign policy. It is left at the elitist level. And so we had a small glimmer when President Ruto, during campaigns, created a foreign policy agenda as part of his campaigns. But I would say this, Olive, foreign policy mostly leans on the side of continuity. Developing states, as Prof says, they do not have the muscle to just quickly change, adjust their foreign policy and say we are moving away from the East to the West. Those are public optics. But normally what happens is that there is always a threat of continuity if you observe. And you'll see that as much as President Uhuru put China at a higher level than it had been before, we still had our ties with the West. And even when it was the end of President Uhuru's term, we had started energizing Kenya Look West policy. So President Ruto comes in and sees the reality. That are a few things. In fact, the way you have put that picture, we are just playing, I was seeing a lot of geostrategic games, the game theory. And it is for the good of China that it looks like that. I think the Chinese, wherever they are, that should be a very good poster picture. That China clearly, sees whatever the situation, Kenya is, and even the president of China mentioned, they look at Kenya in terms of strategic and long-term. And when they see that Kenya, President Ruto, when he came in, even his, you have observed very well, his comments that no debts we must liberate, and then again, part of his cabinet, we remember the China Square issue, Honorable Moses Kuria, it looked like now China was at the end of these diplomatic ties. But the realization that is there when President Ruto went there, it was seen clearly that in the eyes of China, in comparison to Ethiopia, Kenya still holds the most strategic nodule for the BRI. That is the bridge, the road and whatever there. Because look at the behavior of, I'm just building a case, look at the behavior of Ethiopia and its forceful or the struggle to at least have a link to the ocean. You know, it has tried to do that, and it has raised some fury among the Somali people. You know, maybe they misunderstood, but then Ethiopia is really struggling. If Ethiopia had that access to the ocean, it will now supplant Kenya's strategic position. But as things stand, Ethiopia is just there as a game, you know. It's a situation of, in relations, they say, you know, how do you call it? When you're trying to do, you are shooting or you are seducing.
You're wooing.
There's a situation where another person is there for the purposes of making the other person play your game.
All right.
And that is what you are doing there. China knows that the closest rival, as Prof said, the closest rival to Kenya's, I think it is the dog, the closest rival to Kenya's hegemony in the other upper part, leave the lower part, is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been trying to do that, you know, creating even the Horn of Africa initiative. And therefore, how do you make Kenya play the game?
Okay, so I'll ask you to pause there. How do you make Kenya play the game? So that we take a break, a quick break, but we come back also with the thoughts of Prof. Monda. Hatuja kusahau huko New York. So,
Msinisahau, nipo, usinisahau, tafadhali.
We'll come and get your thoughts on the other side of this break.
Karibuni! Hii ndio base ya the best local entertainment. Baby!
Tumefungulia Magic. Starting from the 7th of October, Maisha Magic Plus will be on DSTV Access and GoTV Plus.
You can now manage all your finances with one app. Link your bank cards and enjoy fast, safe, and convenient transactions no matter the bank or mobile money network you're on.
Get ready to dive into the pearls of a generation that's shaping the future.
On this new season of Speaking of Gen Z, we uncover stories and emotions behind relationships, friendship, family, and much more.
It's not about the miles between us, it's about the connections we share.
And this is the Strings Attached edition.
Baby, come give me something,
Can we talk about situationships?
Speaking of Gen Z podcast, the Strings Attached edition. Wednesdays from 10 a.m. on Nation FM and Nation.Africa.
Welcome to Speaking of Gen Z.
To get It's Finished by Njoki Munyi, dial *812*801#.
Skiza na Nation.
All holders are notified to report and surrender unclaimed financial assets to the Unclaimed Financial Assets Authority, UFAA, on or before November 1st, 2023. Visit www.ufaa.go.ke and get started.
Welcome back to AM Live. We have in studio Dr. Githua, Edgar. We also have Nasongo Muliro. We also have Professor Noami Damba. And joining us from across New York, we have Professor David Monda. Hatuja kusahau, but I'll allow you to conclude your point.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much. And I just want to conclude by saying this, that during the BRI, you could see there was a lot of diplomatic wisdom on both sides, China and Kenya, on especially the SOA issues. That China said one thing, you know, recognizing that it said, we recognize the independence of Kenya to pursue its own modernization path according to its own interests, you know, just saying you can still relate with the US, we are aware, but we can continue with our comprehensive agreement that was there during Uhuru Kenyatta's time. Then on the side of Ruto, with a lot of diplomatic wisdom, he said that Kenya affirms the one China policy. You remember we had, President Ruto had earlier met the leader from Taiwan. And people are saying, maybe we could not have done that. We would have met Taiwan after this BRI meeting because Kenya is core in the BRI meeting because of, it is one of the entry points to East Africa and Africa. It has benefited highly, you know, the port, the expressway, and the SGR. So it was also part of the piloting countries. So Kenya had to attend that. But then Kenya, just to confirm that because we met the leader from Taiwan, we have to be clear and say we affirm the one China policy. But then I think it was a bit stretched because the president talked about commenting China for human rights, you know, observation, look at that there. So there was a lot of diplomatic wisdom. It's like two people who are very much allied, but they have had friction, and we are meeting in a situation that we need to correct that. And that is why I say that that picture that we put there in that manner there almost summarizes the thinking of China about Kenya and the position of Ethiopia in all these geopolitical arrangements that we saw there during the meeting on BRI.
Okay, I will now invite you, Professor Monda, finally, to weigh in.
If you give me a chance, maybe I could articulate a couple points in response to the conversation you had, right? So you asked the question, right? What how do we see the success of President Ruto's visit to China? And my response to that would be, I still don't know. And why do I say that? I don't know, and Kenyans don't know, because we do not know the nature of the agreements that were signed. And I think that's one of the big challenges we have with China's debt diplomacy. We still, to this day, do not know the details of the SGR agreement. And the government has not been forthright around that question. So even the agreements that have been signed now, they say the devil is in the details. We still don't know. How long will Kenyans be paying this? What are the trade-offs? What are the strategic agreements that was made? And I think these are some very important concerns that our foreign policy makers should be thinking about, because the people that elected the Ruto administration, which is we the voters, we have a right to know where our tax money is going. And we have a right to know what kind of agreements our government is engaging into. The second element in relation to the Ethiopia-Kenya binary, I take exception to that binary because in economic terms, good economics doesn't know transnational borders. It's all about profitability, and it's all about ease of access and building networks. So I think that the framing of it to say Ethiopia has won and Kenya has lost, I really think misses the point. Ethiopia still really desperately needs Kenya. I say that because if you think of when Eritrea became independent, Ethiopia automatically became landlocked. So it relies on Djibouti for its ocean access. Now, a large section and the most productive sections of Ethiopia are in the highlands, and it makes more sense for Ethiopia to export its product through Lamu than it would be to take that through Djibouti. So I think that's also another narrative in terms of when we think of the Belt and Road Initiative, to think more broadly than around the nationalistic cleavages of colonial borders. So how do we aggregate and scale resources in the East and Central African region so we can have a Mombasa to Kinshasa line, and we can have a Cape to Cairo line that goes through Ethiopia and Kenya, and then the whole region benefits. So I think that that's also very important to think about. The third element is, and I'd like your viewers to think about this, is what is the commemoration around the Belt and Road Initiative? It's really important that President Ruto went there. The president of Egypt was invited because of the 10-year commemoration of the Belt and Road Initiative. Originally, the Chinese constructed the Belt and Road Initiative as an access way for China through its traditional historic routes through Central Asia to Europe. Mm-hmm. But what has really concerned the United States has been how expansive this network has been. That China has now really looked to dominate maritime shipping lines, rail and road networks, and more importantly, information networks. So we now have a digital technology initiative, digital and technology network. We have a health and technology network. And China, with the Belt and Road Initiative, is really seeming to corner a lot of the key ports around the world. So think about it, Ole. Most of the ports that China is really constructing infrastructure to are also very critical nodes for the continental information lines that carry our internet, that carry information and technology. And the US is very concerned around that, because if China is able to capture, for example, major ports in Africa, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in the event of a crisis, the US will very much be sidelined. Now, this brings me to my fourth and final point around the Belt and Road Initiative and some of these maritime and information networks that China is looking to control, but the access of China to these global maritime choke points, be it the Suez Canal, be it the port of Haifa in Israel that we're talking about, that China has actually developed its leverage there. Thinking about Mombasa, thinking about Djibouti as port centers, Panama Canal, and the ports around Singapore, the Malaga Straits. So America and the West are very concerned about China's footprint in Africa in particular, but China's actual accession now to become a global challenger to US domination of the international order, particularly in relation to its relation to, say, Kenya and the developing world. China wants to see, through the Belt and Road Initiative, this idea that a developing country can actually go toe-to-toe with giants in Europe and the United States and can actually be successful. But juxtaposing that is the idea that China wants to be a leader of the global South in the global South. So China knows it can't dominate the US and Europe, but China knows in the developing world, if China can be the voice for Kenya, for Africa, for Latin America, and for Asia, that really gives China a lot of leverage. So in conclusion, I think that there's a whole range of networks and things we need to think about, particularly around this Belt and Road Initiative. China is not coming to Mombasa, is not building SGR or the expressway out of the goodness of its heart. China is very strategic and calculating around accessing resources from Africa and using those resources and capturing those resources that are extremely strategic. My challenge is the lack of transparency around our agreements with the Kenya government and China, concerns around the environment, and taking away of land of indigenous populations. The third element is around the broader question of where that positions Kenya in relation to its strategic and traditional allies on the West compared with China on the East. So I think those are variants in terms of thinking of this Belt and Road Initiative. what is Kenya's position within this Belt and Road Initiative? Because we really need to look at ourselves as active participants in this global game of access of power, both from the US and from China. We are not benign actors. Kenya has a strategic place. Okay. And it's important for our foreign policy makers to construct our interests around Kenyan diplomacy to then give us leverage so that as much as China is benefiting from the Belt and Road Initiative, that Kenyan core interests are also catered for, that there's transparency, that there's questions around environmental concerns, but lastly, that there's also a respect for Kenyans, because China has got a very bad rap in its soft diplomacy around how it's treated Kenyan workers, around how it's treated a lot of Africans in some of these mega projects.
All right, and speaking of the environment, and I'll come to you, Prof, I just want to get Dr. Githua's thoughts on something. And before I ask my question, but speaking of the environment, Xi did state that they're now focusing on projects that are open, green, and clean. But we'll get more into that. But first, Dr. Githua, I know we focused really, on account of this article, on Ethiopia, Kenya having ceded ground to Ethiopia. I know part of the reason, perhaps, that the East African drew the parallel or the comparison is because when you look at this article, Ethiopia, which recently joined BRICS, so that's another element, right, has lately become the biggest economy in Eastern Africa with a GDP of $156 billion against Kenya's $118 billion according to the IMF. And quoted here, China is ready to step up bilateral cooperation under BRI and BRICS frameworks. So quoted here is Wu Peng, a senior Chinese diplomat, after Dr. Abiy met with President Xi Jinping. But what of Tanzania? Because have we ceded ground to Tanzania? And the reason I ask that is, and I just want to trace that paragraph here, but let me see, here we go. A look at recent BRI trends shows African countries that look uncertain may be abandoned. For example, when Kenya initially looked reluctant to deal with Beijing, China signed Tanzania onto the BRI. And while the team, has more broadly raised the question of Ethiopia's access to the Indian Ocean and the trade routes therein and etc., e-commerce and all of that. But unlike Ethiopia, Tanzania is perfectly situated. Just looking at the Business Daily this morning, Mombasa Port set for fresh dredging on Dar rivalry. Exactly. The Mombasa Port is set for a fresh round of dredging spooked by similar upcoming accessway expansion works at the rival Dar es Salaam that risks shifting more business to the gateway of neighboring country. Further down, Tanzania overtakes Kenya on best investment destinations in region. Tanzania has beaten Kenya on the best investment destinations for investors, eyeing to make deals in the region in the next 2 years, according to findings of a survey conducted by advisory firm KPMG among 150 C-suite level and senior executives in the sub-Saharan Africa.
So thanks, Oli, for that for that analysis. It's true. Already, Mombasa is already reacting to Tanzania's dredging of the port. Of course, when you dredge the port, it means bigger ships, bigger capacity, and all that. And then, unlike Ethiopia, Tanzania has access to the ocean. Remember, there is the Tanzania-Zambia Railway, the Tazara Railway. So the Chinese signing on Tanzania on the BRI project, they are looking at leveraging on how to improve that Tazara Railway into the central and southern parts of Africa, all the way probably to their BRICS partner, big brother in Africa, South Africa. So you can see that, borrowing from what Muliro talked about, if Kenya is playing hard to get, let's use that analogy. If Kenya wants to play hard to get, China is geostrategically and geopolitically telling Kenya we have Ethiopia and we have Tanzania. We will still get into Africa one way or another. So it's in Kenya's interest to just get on with the program. DRC has joined the East African community. That's a huge open market. It has potential to connect with the extra financing that is going to extend the SGR from Naivasha all the way to Malaba, connecting into Uganda, hopefully into DRC, all the way to the Atlantic, because Kinshasa, I think, is a port right all the way. So China views Kenya as being very strategic. But if also Kenya decides to drop the ball, okay, if our foreign policy and our economists do not see the big picture, China will still use Tanzania and will be able to get into DRC because they are looking at connecting this BRI project all the way through to Kinshasa. A throughway system of not only taking in goods, but largely what's in DRC, the minerals, vast minerals within the DRC. China is interested in, China is strategically, I like the way what my fellow presenter has talked about. It is not altruism here. China is not doing it for the good of Africa per se. They are thinking about their own interests. And what are their interests? Fuel. They're thinking about market for their goods. They're thinking about Africa already has a population of 1.3 billion people. Africa has huge reserves in the East African community going to the DRC, and Kenya is one of the major gateways. So either way, they will not ignore us, in my view, but if we play hard to get, like I keep on saying, Ethiopia and Tanzania are going to be gateways into the East and Central of Africa. So my advice to Kenya is right now, let's also leverage and get the benefits that they can give us. There are, I saw like Huawei. Huawei is a huge digital, tech digital. It's one of the biggest tech digital companies in the world. Let's leverage on that technology. In the digital economy space, let China come and invest heavily in that. Green energy and all these other things. So I think we should hedge our bets, looking at the global geopolitics, know how to relate with both the East and the West, depending on our interests. But we cannot afford to ignore China. And I like what Muliro said. Foreign policy is based on continuity and change. Even if you change, you have to maintain elements of continuity. So we will continue being very important for China. And if we play around Tanzania, yes, you can already see what economists are saying. There are taxes, the cost of doing business there. Ethiopia, let me just take you back to Ethiopia. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is already full. The biggest dam, I think currently, is the biggest dam in Africa, I think. The one that has caused a lot of rift between Sudan and Egypt and Ethiopia. China already sees Ethiopia is going to be energy reliant, it's going to be energy secure. It's already going to be energy secure. So very many investments in China and the cost of doing business in Ethiopia is going to be much cheaper than in doing business in Kenya. So when you see China preferring and looking at Ethiopia, it's because it knows it's going to reap more maybe from the Ethiopian economy based on the cost of power in Ethiopia. So Kenya needs to get on the program, and I think we are going to get on the program because we will not be left behind, because either way, China is going to go into East and Central Africa, either through us or through Tanzania if we drop the ball.
Okay. Yeah. Prof, another statement that caught my attention, and you can respond. I know you wanted to make a rejoinder, but even as you do that, another statement that stood out for me that Xi made was that China will be promoting integrity-based Belt and Road Cooperation. What do you read into that? But go ahead.
Oh. Olive, let me make one point, and then I want to do my summation. Right now in Kenya, 72% of our overall foreign debt is controlled by China. President Magufuli wanted to get down to the bottom of all loans and what the country has negotiated forever. And he was particularly concerned about the control of gas in Tanzania by foreigners. And so he invited a friend of mine from Trinidad and Tobago, Professor Julius. Trinidad and Tobago are the only black countries that were able to extract their own gas and oil and sell it and control it on the black market. So Julius is well known all over the world. And he invited Julian and said, we don't know what's happening. We don't know who controls our gas. We don't know how these transactions were made. So I need you to help us. And Julian spent quite some time with his crew figuring out everything. When he came back to make his report, he invited me to the State House in Tanzania, together in front of Magufuli. And he said to him, you don't have control of any gas for 60 years. And at that time, it's estimated that your gas will be gone. And, you know, he looked at him and he said, what can we do? And Julian advised him to buy back, you know, from all the people, Shell Oil, all these companies who have controlled the oil. And he said he will save the country. You know, that is the best thing Magufuli has ever done for Tanzania. And no African country has ever done that. He borrowed money and he paid them off, such that when Shell Oil or Exxon Valdez or anybody want to come and explore gas in Tanzania, they're given only a small truck on which they extract and get their money and leave the country. And so when you see Tanzania supplying gas to Kenya and all others, that is the money Tanzania control. The professor, David, mentioned several things. We don't have control over what is happening, over our transaction with China. We don't know who did it, when, how it was done. We don't know how many years was signed. You know, you can thumb through all data and everything, and you can't find clean information about that. It is possible that in the future will become a debt trap for China, on which China will say, we are going to run your rail system, we're going to control your port until we got our money. That is the case with the Bangladesh right now. Let me end with this recommendation. We need to increase our total value of export to China by exporting value-added items. We need to know the Chinese market and export value-added. China has to open its market to Kenya. It has to be reciprocal, because Xi Jinping does not wake up early in the morning and think about so many kids who have not eaten in Kenya. He thinks about China. That is fine. That is their interest. But we also have our interest. We need to decrease the value of total import of certain product. Chinese are building in the area where I live, Lavington, Kilimani, they're building tall buildings. But everything comes from China, include wood carpet that we can do here. So we go to China, buy them in bulk, and then send our value, send money to China, and take it out of Kenya, and stop our workers from engaging in creating all this value added. This is happening as we are sitting. We borrow Chinese money. Let's borrow Chinese money through African Development Bank, so that everybody borrow at the lowest interest rate, pay at a low interest rate for a minimum 30-year loan. And then we'll be all friends. We need to renegotiate the loan term, which was signed by President Uhuru, and I don't know what President Ruto signed the other day. But we need to renegotiate so that we can have ability to be able to pay at the time that Chinese exposure. If China want to be our friend, and if we truly want to develop a reciprocal relationship, if we want to be able to have a mix of Western interests and Chinese interests, yes, that's the way to go. But we should not join BRICS just to replace the Western interest, not knowing who is doing what. We cannot do that.
All right, I'll invite you, Nasongo, to have the last word on this. But even as you do that, because you mentioned Huawei, Dr. Githua, President Ruto witnesses, and this was when Monday, signing of MOU with Huawei to further develop ICT infrastructure on transportation, e-government, education, and digital energy. Kenya sign, yes, perhaps I was trying to say China ends, you know. Kenya-China signed 63 billion shilling business deals for ICT, pharmaceutical and engineering sectors, signing done at Investment Forum hosted by President Ruto in Beijing. Even as you make your last remarks, your thoughts on this statement? China will be promoting integrity-based Belt and Road cooperation.
I don't know at the back of your mind, Olive, what you have about that.
I'm just curious.
And it's what I had mentioned earlier, you know, if you mention issues of human rights, then some connotations arise if you mention them in the same line with China. So I think when you mention integrity in the same line with Kenya, people raise some issues of connotations. But I think his line of thinking, China, whenever China talks about integrity, respect, and everything, is normally not so much about internal governance. It's normally a message to its global competitors that it has labeled as people who come in and negotiate in bad faith, they are oppressive, because China runs on a principle of non-interference. It doesn't wish mostly to look at the internal issues, especially governance, human rights, and even economic prudence. They put that as domestic affairs that do not require external interference.
Just to add on to that briefly.
I just want
to add on to that very briefly. He also, and actually I see where you're coming from, because he also stated we stand against, what we stand against are unilateral sanctions, economic coercion, and decoupling and supply chain disruption. But go ahead.
So China sees the previous traditional allies of Africa, that's the West, as people who do not have integrity, they are from top down, they're oppressive. But I would say this, that if you look at the strategy, I'm not holding forth for anybody. If you look at the strategy of, I don't know whether he knows it's a strategy, of President Ruto, is that he ran something like a dual-track diplomacy, so to say, in the sense that whenever he visits a country, he looks for ways in which he goes beyond the state-to-state bilaterals, the normal ones, but he always looks for ways in which he can address directly the private investors in those countries. This was done in New York. This was done again in China. President Ruto spent more time, even a round-table discussion with private investors in China. So he's running both, that as we do the government-to-government talks, why can't I appeal directly to the private investors? And I think the US has done that very well for him. The Kenyan ambassador took her time even to travel around the entire states in the US, meeting not government, but private investors with the government delegation. So that is a dual track. And if you look at what is happening, you know what you say, as the media says, Tanzania is now destination favorite, Ethiopia is coming. That is affairs that Kenya went through long time ago. These are coming from far, coming in. And I say this because for a long time, Kenya has been like the laboratory of Western ideas. Since the time of Jomo Kenyatta. You know, Jomo Kenyatta took a very straight line that we are capitalists. And we had all these aspects of the most favorite place and everything. So the question you should always be asking yourself, Olive, is that whenever a country is praised or a country is told that it's favorite, from whose perspective? And for what interest? So if you look at Kenya, there are some internal mechanisms. In terms of governance, we are very far ahead in the sense that it is the force of the people, the opposition, and the civil society, that even before, when the president was going to China, he even signed, you remember, the finance bill that now caps borrowing at a percentage. It's not just easy and open to that level. So just to close that, you'll see that another rising aspect on this issue is that, is it this week or next week? The deputy president is supposed to attend now the other version of BRI in Europe called the Global Gateway Forum. Right. And you can see all these are playing within the same state. So there are so many suitors in the same state that other states must get out because of the strategic position of Kenya.
All right. I'm sorry, I know today I've not done you justice. I will make good on it, but I want to thank you for being in studio this morning nonetheless, and also from New York. We've had in studio Nasongo Muliro, Foreign Policy and Security Specialist, GLOSEPS. We've also had Dr. Edgar Githua, International Affairs, Security and Diplomacy Analyst, Professor David Monda joining us from New York. Professor of Political Science, City University of New York, and Professor Noah Midamba, Professor of Defense and Foreign Policy. You can find the full-length show on NTV Kenya's YouTube channel. My name is Olive Burrows. Good morning.